The first warning came from the water bucket. At dawn, Clara Whitmore lowered a tin cup into it and struck ice, not a thin skin across the top. The bucket had frozen nearly solid inside the cave where she had slept. Outside, the November wind was driving snow across the Tennessee mountains. Clara stared at the ice, then at the small fire struggling near the cave mouth. She had been driven from Pine Hollow only 3 days earlier. Now the mountain was showing her exactly how quickly a bad shelter could become a grave. Clara was 22 years old. She had brown hair she kept pinned beneath an old wool scarf, a patched gray coat, worn boots, and everything she still owned packed into one canvas bundle. Pine Hollow lay 2 miles below the ridge. She had been born there. Her father had repaired wagons and hunted the upper slopes. Her mother had grown beans, dried herbs, and helped neighboring women through difficult winters. Both were gone now. After her mother's death that summer, the small cabin Clara had lived in became the subject of a village council meeting. Samuel Voss wanted it for his married son. Samuel owned the sawmill. He supplied lumber to half the settlement. When he spoke at council meetings, men usually listened. Clara had no husband, no brothers, and no money to challenge him. The decision took less than an hour. She was allowed to keep her clothes, 2 blankets, a cooking pot, a hatchet, and whatever food she could carry. 3 days later, she walked out. At the edge of Pine Hollow, the road divided. The southern trail led toward another settlement. The northern trail climbed toward Beartooth Ridge. Clara stood there while cold wind pulled loose strands of hair across her face. Then she looked north. Her father had taken her onto that ridge when she was a child. He had shown her where deer crossed after snow. He had shown her which slopes stayed dry after rain. Most important, he had taught her to watch the mountain before choosing where to sleep. Clara turned north. If you have ever wondered how much a person can build after losing nearly everything, stay with Clara through this winter, because the cave she was walking toward would eventually matter to people who had watched her leave. But first, she had to survive long enough to understand it herself. The cave was not impressive. It was a shallow opening beneath a limestone shelf, perhaps 14 feet deep, and barely tall enough for Clara to stand near the entrance. The floor was dirt and stone. Dead leaves filled the back. Water stains marked one wall, but the opening faced southeast. That mattered. The ridge behind it blocked the northwest wind. That mattered more. On her first evening, Clara dragged dry leaves into a thick bed and wrapped herself in both blankets. By midnight, the leaves had flattened beneath her. Cold climbed through the ground. Her knees drew toward her chest. Her jaw tightened until her teeth hurt. She spent most of the night shifting positions, trying to keep one part of her body from pressing against the frozen earth for too long. Morning brought the frozen bucket. Clara struck the ice with the handle of her hatchet. Nothing happened. She hit it again. A crack appeared. She crouched beside the bucket, watching that narrow line spread through the ice. Her father had once told her that winter rarely killed through one great mistake. It worked through small ones: wet boots, an empty stomach, too much wind, a fire placed badly, a sleeping bed too close to frozen ground. Clara looked around the cave. She had made several of those mistakes already. She stood. For the rest of that morning, she stopped treating the cave as something she had found. She began treating it as something she had to build. The first problem was the entrance. Wind curled around the limestone shelf and entered low across the ground. It moved directly over her sleeping place before escaping upward. Clara carried stones from the slope until her shoulders burned. She stacked them across the lower half of the entrance. The first wall reached her knee before collapsing. 3 stones rolled outside. One struck her boot. Clara pulled her foot back and pressed both hands against her thighs. Her fingers were red and split around the nails. She looked at the fallen stones. Then she picked up the first one. On the second attempt, she dug shallow grooves beneath the bottom stones. She wedged smaller rocks between the larger pieces. That wall lasted 20 minutes. Then one side leaned inward. Clara caught it with both hands. The weight pushed her backward. She let it fall rather than crush her fingers. Dust rose around her boots. For several seconds, she simply stood there, breathing through her nose. Then she noticed something. Mud. The dirt beneath the fallen stones was damp. Clara knelt and squeezed a handful. It held together. She mixed the mud with dry grass gathered beneath the limestone shelf and pressed it between the stones. This time she built slowly. One layer, then another. By late afternoon, a low wall crossed most of the cave entrance, leaving a narrow opening on one side and open space above for smoke. Clara went to the back of the cave and crouched. The difference reached her skin immediately. The wind no longer swept across her ankles. She held one hand near the floor. Still air. Not warm, but still. That night she made a small fire behind the wall. She heated water and ate a handful of dried beans softened in the pot. The flames warmed her face while her back remained cold. Then she noticed the stones surrounding the fire. When the flames weakened, the stones stayed warm. Clara touched one. She pulled her hand away, waited, then touched it again. Her mother had done something similar during hard winters. She would warm smooth stones near the hearth, wrap them in old cloth, and place them beneath the blankets before bed. Clara looked toward her sleeping place. She found 2 flat stones. She warmed them beside the fire for nearly an hour, then moved them carefully with 2 pieces of wood. She buried them beneath a thick layer of dry moss and leaves. Then she spread her blankets over the top. When she lay down, warmth slowly reached through the bedding. Her shoulders loosened. Her hands stopped gripping the blanket. For the first time since leaving Pine Hollow, Clara slept for several hours without waking. The mountain had given her nothing freely. Every small improvement had cost labor. The next morning, she searched the southern face of the ridge and found thick moss beneath a stand of pine. She carried it back by the armful. Instead of spreading it loosely, she packed it deep beneath her sleeping place so her weight would not flatten everything against the ground. Then she gathered wood. Not just branches. She sorted them. Dry pieces went beneath the rock shelf. Damp pieces were stacked near the entrance, where moving air could reach them. Small fuel remained beside the fire. Larger pieces went against the wall. By the 4th evening, the cave looked different. So did Clara. Dirt marked her cheeks. A strip of cloth covered a cut across her palm. Her boots were wet around the edges, but her movements had changed. She no longer searched randomly. Every trip outside had a purpose. Every object had a place. Then the food began running low. Clara counted what remained beside the fire: a little cornmeal, a handful of beans, 2 strips of dried meat. Enough for several days if she ate carefully. Not enough for winter. She stared into the flames. The shelter could keep wind away. The stones could hold heat. The moss could protect her from the frozen ground. None of it could feed her. The next morning, she followed animal tracks into the trees. Her father had taught her how to recognize rabbit paths where brush narrowed their movement. Clara found one beneath a fallen pine. She made a crude snare from cord taken from her canvas bundle. The following morning it was empty. She reset it. The second morning, empty again. By the third, her stomach tightened hard enough to wake her before sunrise. She drank hot water and went back outside. Still empty. That evening, snow began falling harder. Clara returned to the cave carrying nothing. She sat beside the fire and poured the last of the cornmeal into her palm. There was barely enough for one meal. She closed her fingers around it. For anyone who has faced a long winter, there comes a point when survival stops being about strength. It becomes a question of whether the next small choice buys another morning. Clara cooked only half. She saved the rest. Before sleeping, she checked the entrance wall, added wood to the fire, and placed 2 heated stones beneath the moss. Then she heard something outside. A scrape. Clara sat upright. Another scrape came from beyond the stone wall. Closer this time. She reached for the hatchet. Snow moved past the cave opening. Then something struck the stones hard enough to shake loose a clump of frozen mud. Clara rose slowly, hatchet tight in her hand. Whatever had found her cave was standing just beyond the firelight. The stones moved again. Clara stepped closer to the entrance. Her fire threw a weak orange light across the low wall. Beyond it, snow drifted sideways through the dark. Then a head appeared above the stones. Not a man. A young mule. Its ears were pinned back. Snow covered its neck and face. A torn leather strap hung from one side of its harness. Clara lowered the hatchet. The animal tried to step forward and struck the wall again with one knee. "Easy." Her voice sounded strange after so many days alone. She moved outside. The wind immediately pushed cold through her coat. The mule stood against the rock shelf, shaking hard enough to make the loose harness buckle knock against its ribs. There was no wagon, no rider, no lantern below the ridge. Clara ran one hand along the animal's shoulder and found dried blood beneath the harness. The skin had been rubbed raw. She cut the damaged strap loose with her knife. The mule flinched, then stood still. Clara looked downslope. The snow was already covering the tracks. Someone had lost this animal recently. That meant someone might still be out there. She brought the mule beneath the deepest part of the rock shelf and tied it where the wind could not reach it directly. Then she filled her pot with warm water. The animal drank slowly. Clara gave it a small portion of the dried grass she had collected for mixing mud. It was not proper feed, but it chewed. That was enough for the moment. At first light, Clara followed the mule's tracks. They descended east, before disappearing beneath fresh snow. She moved carefully, using a pine branch as a walking stick. Half a mile below the cave, she found the wagon. It had slipped sideways off the narrow trail. One wheel was broken. The wagon bed leaned against two trees. A canvas cover snapped in the wind. Clara approached slowly. "Hello?" No answer. She stepped around the rear wheel. A man was lying beside the wagon. He was perhaps 50, broad through the shoulders, with a gray beard and a wool cap pulled low over his forehead. His eyes opened when Clara touched his coat. "Don't move." He tried anyway. His face tightened. Clara looked at his left leg. It was trapped beneath a wooden supply box. She wedged a fallen branch beneath the edge and pushed down with both hands. The box moved barely an inch. The man pulled his leg free. He rolled onto his back and drew air through clenched teeth. Horse? Mule. His eyes closed for 1 second. "Name's Jasper." "Clara." She checked his leg. No bone showed through the skin, but the ankle had swollen badly. He could not walk without help. Clara looked at the ridge above them. The cave was close enough. The village was much farther. "We go up." Jasper stared at her. "Up? You won't make Pine Hollow like this." He looked toward the mountain. Then toward Clara. She helped him stand. They moved slowly. Jasper leaned on the same branch Clara had used as a walking stick. She carried part of his weight on her shoulder. Each 100 yards took several minutes. By the time the cave came into view, Clara could feel sweat beneath her coat despite the cold. That was dangerous. She slowed. Jasper tried to move faster. She stopped him. "You get wet under that coat, you freeze later." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. Inside the cave, Jasper stopped speaking. His eyes moved across the stone wall, then the moss bed, then the dark stones arranged near the fire. Clara helped him sit. The mule stood beneath the outer ledge. Jasper looked toward it and released a long breath through his nose. That animal was carrying half my winter trade. Clara said nothing. She heated water. Jasper noticed the 2 flat stones beside the fire. "What are those for?" "Sleeping." He looked confused. Clara wrapped one in cloth and placed it near his injured ankle. Not directly on the skin. Jasper rested both hands around the warm stone. His shoulders dropped. "Where'd you learn that?" "Home." The answer came before Clara could stop it. The words stayed between them. Jasper did not ask more. The broken wagon carried more than trade goods. Once the weather eased, Clara returned with Jasper and brought back what they could save. A sack of oats. Salt. 3 candles. A small iron pan. a coil of rope, a wool blanket, a bag containing turnip seed and dried beans. Jasper offered Clara half. She shook her head. "You'll need it. So will you." He pushed the bag toward her. Clara looked down at the seeds. For the first time since climbing the ridge, she was holding something meant for spring. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Spring. She took the turnip seed. Jasper kept the rest. They stayed in the cave for 4 days. His ankle improved slowly. During that time, he watched Clara work. She checked the wind before cutting firewood. She dried damp branches near the cave mouth instead of throwing them straight into the fire. She rotated heated stones near the sleeping area. She repaired gaps in the entrance wall with mud mixed with dry grass. On the second evening, Jasper touched the lower wall. This stays warmer than the outside stone. The mud helps. And the grass? Holds it together. He pressed his thumb against a dried section. "You could do this on a cabin wall." Clara looked at him. "Probably." Jasper gave a small nod. He was not looking at the cave anymore. He was thinking about buildings below the ridge. On the 4th morning, he could put weight on the injured leg. Clara walked him halfway down the mountain. Before they separated, Jasper stopped. "You know what people are saying in Pine Hollow?" Clara's face changed only slightly. "No. They think you left the county." She adjusted the rope over her shoulder. "I didn't. I can see that." Jasper looked back toward the ridge. "You've got more protection up there than some houses down below." Clara did not answer. He waited. Then he said, "There's been trouble." She looked at him. Cold came early. 2 cellars took water. Henry Cole lost 3 sheep. The north cabins can't keep heat after midnight. Clara's fingers tightened around the rope. For a few seconds, she could see Pine Hollow clearly. The well, the sawmill, the narrow houses along the road, her mother's kitchen window. Then she turned her eyes back to the ridge. "I'm not going down." Jasper nodded once. "I didn't ask you to." He continued toward the village. Clara climbed back alone. That afternoon, she opened the turnip seed and poured a few dark seeds into her palm. She had found a narrow strip of soil near the cave, where the winter sun remained longest. When the ground softened, she could work ash into it. Maybe moss. Maybe manure if she could trade for some. She folded the seeds carefully inside cloth and placed them near the back wall. Then she heard the mule shift outside. The animal had stayed. Jasper had left it temporarily, because the ankle made leading it down unsafe. Clara had begun calling it Buck. Buck had also begun giving Clara something she had not expected: manure. She gathered it, mixed it with dead leaves, and created a small covered pile near the sunny side of the ledge. Her father had composted yard waste behind their house. Her mother had used the dark soil around beans and squash. Clara could almost hear her explaining it. Waste was only waste if you failed to use it twice. By the middle of December, the cave had stopped looking temporary. A narrow shelf made from split wood held her food. The new iron pan hung beside the fire. Rope secured the woodpile beneath the ledge. A second low stone barrier protected Buck from the prevailing wind. Clara's body had changed too. Her hands were rough. Her movements were slower, but more exact. She wasted fewer steps. Then the temperature dropped. The first night, the water seeped near the cave slowed. The second night, Buck's breath froze along the hair around his muzzle. On the third morning, Clara walked outside and heard trees cracking in the valley below. The sound came from deep inside the trunks, sharp, dry, one after another. She looked north. The sky was clear, too clear. No clouds to hold warmth near the ground. No softness in the light. That afternoon, Clara climbed to an exposed shelf and looked toward Pine Hollow. Smoke rose from the village chimneys. Most of it moved normally, but one chimney at the northern edge produced almost nothing. Clara knew that cabin. Old Matthew Ward lived there with his daughter and 2 grandchildren. The house sat directly in the path of the north wind. She watched for nearly a minute. Still almost no smoke. Clara went back to the cave. She added wood to the protected stack. filled the water pot, checked every gap in the wall. Then she looked again toward the village. She had promised herself she would not go back, not to ask, not to explain, not to stand in front of the same people who had decided she was easier to remove than protect. That promise had carried her up the mountain, but the cold below did not care about promises. Just before sunset, a figure appeared on the lower trail. Then another. 2 people, both climbing. One carried a shovel, the other carried a blanket wrapped around something small. Clara stood at the cave entrance. The figures came closer. The one with the blanket slipped to one knee, recovered, then kept climbing. When they were near enough for Clara to recognize them, her hand tightened against the stone wall. It was Matthew Ward's daughter. And inside the blanket, a child was no longer moving. The child's face was almost colorless. Clara moved before either woman spoke. Inside, Matthew Ward's daughter, Ruth, stumbled through the cave entrance with the bundled boy in her arms. Behind her came Thomas Bell, one of the village farmhands, carrying a shovel and breathing hard through a scarf crusted with ice. Clara pulled the blanket back. The boy was 6. His name was Eli. She remembered him chasing chickens near the Ward cabin the previous summer. Now his lips were pale, and his hands were stiff against his chest. Ruth's voice shook. He stopped answering me halfway up. Clara touched Eli's cheek, then his neck. Cold. Too cold. But there was still breath. Weak. Shallow. Clara pointed toward the moss bed. Lay him there. Ruth started lowering him beside the fire. Clara caught her arm. Not that close. Ruth stared at her. He needs heat. He needs it slow. Clara moved 2 warmed stones from beside the fire. She wrapped them in cloth and placed one near Eli's feet and another beside his ribs, leaving space between the heat and his skin. Then she added another blanket beneath him. Wet clothes? Ruth nodded. Some. Take them off. Ruth hesitated. Clara was already turning away to give her privacy. Dry everything near the fire, not over it. Thomas stood near the entrance watching. His eyes moved over the cave the same way Jasper's had. The low wall, the bed raised on moss, the stacked wood. The stones heating in rotation. Nothing looked grand. That was what made it harder to understand. The place worked because almost nothing in it was wasted. Ruth wrapped Eli in dry cloth. Clara heated water. She touched the boy's wrist again. A faint pulse. Still there. Keep talking to him. Ruth bent close. Eli. No answer. She rubbed his hair between her fingers. Eli, Mama's here. Clara handed her warm water. Small sips only if he wakes. Ruth nodded. Then she looked at Clara. Our stove went out twice last night. Clara said nothing. The wind comes straight through the north wall. We packed rags in the cracks. It didn't matter. Thomas spoke from the entrance. Ward's not the only house. Clara looked at him. 3 more are freezing after midnight. Maybe 4. He took off one glove and held his hand near the fire. People are burning through wood too fast. Clara glanced at the woodpile. How fast? Some are cutting green timber now. That was bad. Green wood smoked heavily and gave less heat. Clara turned toward the entrance. The sky outside was still painfully clear. The cold would deepen again after dark. Thomas followed her eyes. They sent us because Jasper said you knew how to hold heat. Clara looked back at him. They sent you? He shifted his weight. Not the council. That answer mattered. Ruth looked up from Eli. I came because my son was going cold in my arms. Clara's jaw tightened. Then Eli moved. Just one finger. Ruth froze. Eli? His eyelids fluttered. His mouth opened slightly. Clara crouched. Don't sit him up. Ruth nodded quickly. Eli took one deeper breath, then another. Color began returning around his mouth. Ruth pressed her hand over her own lips. Clara watched the boy's breathing for several minutes before standing. He stays here tonight. Ruth looked toward the opening. What about my father? Thomas answered before Clara could. I'll go back. Clara turned to him. No. Thomas frowned. You climb down now. You'll lose daylight halfway. I know the trail. Not in this cold. Thomas looked at the cave, then at Clara. What do we do? Clara stepped outside. She looked across the slope. There were enough loose stones, enough dry grass beneath protected shelves, enough timber if gathered carefully. Not enough time to rebuild whole houses, but perhaps they did not need whole houses rebuilt. She turned back. You take the idea down tomorrow. Thomas waited. Clara pointed at the entrance wall. Block the wind low, leave smoke room high. Then she pointed toward the fire. Use stone around the heat. She lifted one of the flat rocks with a stick. Warm these, wrap them, move them to beds. Thomas nodded slowly. Clara continued. Get people off the floor. With what? Straw, moss, dry leaves. Anything thick that holds air. Thomas looked toward Ruth, then back to Clara. What about the houses themselves? Clara crouched beside the wall. She pushed a thumb into the dried mud and grass mixture. Pack this into the worst cracks. Thomas touched it. Just mud? Mud and dry grass. He looked at the stones. And this holds? Better than open air. He nodded. Something changed in his face. He was no longer asking whether Clara had survived by luck. He was deciding what he could carry back. That evening, 4 people slept inside the cave. Eli beside the rear wall, Ruth beside him, Thomas near the entrance, Clara closest to the fire. The space was crowded. The air grew warmer simply from bodies occupying it. But Clara noticed another problem. Smoke. With 4 people inside, the fire needed to stay stronger. The smoke layer dropped lower. Clara opened the upper vent slightly. Cold air entered. The balance changed immediately. Too much opening and they lost heat. Too little and the smoke thickened. Clara spent half the night adjusting it. By morning, Eli was sitting up. He drank warm broth from Clara's tin cup. His hands still shook, but he spoke. I'm hungry. Ruth laughed once and lowered her face into both hands. Clara poured more broth. Thomas watched her. You saved him. Clara shook her head. He was still breathing when you got here. That's not what I said. Clara did not answer. At first light, Thomas left for Pine Hollow. Ruth and Eli stayed. Before he went, Clara stopped him. One more thing. Thomas turned. Watch the chimneys. He frowned. If smoke starts backing inside, don't just lower the fire and stay quiet. He understood. Someone in the village had already done that. Clear the flue. Yes? And if you can't? Move people. Clara nodded. Thomas went down the mountain. By noon, Pine Hollow had changed. Not completely, not neatly, but enough. Thomas went first to Matthew Ward's cabin. He and Jasper stacked a low stone barrier against the north wall, where the wind struck hardest. They packed mud and chopped straw into the gaps between wall boards. Inside, Ruth's father helped lift the bed frames onto blocks and filled the space beneath the mattresses with dry hay. At the Finch house, 2 women heated smooth river stones beside the stove. They wrapped them in old wool and carried them to the children's beds before sunset. At Henry Cole's barn, men built a second interior barrier behind the damaged north wall. The animals were moved into the smaller protected section, where their own body heat would not be lost across the entire building. No one had enough material to make things comfortable. That was not the goal. They were buying degrees. 1 degree. Then another. 1 hour of retained heat. Then another. By dusk, the village looked rougher than it had that morning. Walls were patched. Windows were partly covered. Beds were moved. Buckets were shifted away from outside walls. People who had always slept in separate rooms were crowding into smaller spaces. The settlement had stopped trying to preserve ordinary life. It had begun arranging itself around survival. That night, the temperature dropped again. Clara knew it before darkness fully settled. The stone outside the cave felt different beneath her hand. Sharper. Buck shifted beneath the outer shelf and stamped one hoof repeatedly. Ruth noticed. What is it? Another cold drop. How bad? Clara looked toward the northern sky. Bad enough. Ruth pulled Eli closer. Clara added wood to the fire. Then she heard footsteps. Many this time. She stepped outside. 6 figures were climbing toward the cave. 2 men, 3 women, 1 older boy. Each carried something. Blankets, a sack, tools, a wooden box. Jasper was among them. When he reached the ledge, he set the box down. Inside were iron nails, 2 small hinges, and a short hand saw. Clara looked at him. What is this? Trade. She looked at the others. A woman placed a sack of cornmeal beside the box. Another set down dried apples. The older boy carried a bundle of wool. Jasper wiped ice from his beard. They don't all need to stay here. Clara waited. They need to learn. For the next 3 hours, Clara showed them everything, not as a speech, as work. She showed them how to choose a wall position by feeling the wind at ankle height. She showed them how to make the lower barrier heavy enough to stop drafts without trapping smoke. She showed them how to dry damp wood before burning it, how to heat stone without cracking it, how to use moss and straw beneath a bed, how to make a smaller warm area inside a larger cold room, how to keep drinking water from freezing by moving it closer to the center of the shelter. Every person repeated the work with their own hands. Jasper rebuilt one section of the wall. The older boy mixed mud and straw. One woman tested the vent. Another arranged the bedding. Clara corrected them when needed. Nothing more. When they left, the trail down the ridge was marked by a line of footprints and sled marks. Each person carried less food than they had brought, but more knowledge. Clara stood outside until the last figure disappeared. Then Ruth came beside her. You could come back. Clara kept looking down the slope. To Pine Hollow. I heard you. Ruth waited. Clara finally looked at her. The house isn't mine. People are talking about that. Clara's face stayed still. What people say in winter changes when spring comes. Ruth had no answer. The next morning she and Eli left. The cave became quiet again. For 2 days, no one climbed the ridge. Clara repaired the wall, checked her traps, fed Buck, sorted the turnip seeds. Then, on the 3rd afternoon, she saw a dark shape moving below the pine line. One man, walking alone, slowly. He carried no supplies, no trade goods, no tools. As he came closer, Clara recognized the coat. Samuel Voss, the man whose voice had carried the council decision that removed her from her home. He reached the ledge and stopped outside the stone wall. For the first time since November, Clara stood face to face with the man who had sent her into winter. Samuel removed his hat. His hair was white around the temples now. His mouth opened once, then closed. Clara waited. Finally, he looked at the cave behind her, then at the wall, then back at Clara. We need your help. Clara did not move. Samuel Voss stood outside the cave with his hat in both hands. Snow clung to the shoulders of his coat. Clara did not invite him in. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Samuel looked toward the valley. The Finch family has almost no grain left. Clara stayed still. Cole lost more livestock. Samuel swallowed and rubbed one thumb along the edge of his hat. And the north houses are failing faster than we can repair them. Clara looked at his hands. They were cracked from cold. Not councilman's hands now. Winter had made them look like everyone else's. What do you want from me? Samuel raised his eyes. We want you to come down. Clara's face did not change. No. The answer landed hard. Samuel nodded once. I thought you might say that. Then why climb? Because asking was still required. Clara looked past him toward Pine Hollow. Smoke rose from the valley in thin gray lines. Several chimneys were weak. One had stopped completely. Samuel followed her gaze. We can bring people here. The cave won't hold a village. I know? Then you need to change the village. Samuel looked back at her. Clara stepped outside. She pointed toward the low wall across the cave entrance. Every house doesn't need rebuilding. Samuel listened. Make smaller rooms inside the rooms you already have. He frowned. Close unused spaces. Move families together. Block the lowest drafts first. Clara touched the mud and grass packing between the stones. Use this anywhere air comes through. Samuel crouched and pressed it with one finger. Will it last? Long enough. That answer seemed to catch him. Long enough had become the measure of everything. Clara walked toward Buck's shelter. She showed Samuel the second windbreak. Animals too. Stop heating a whole barn with bodies spread across it. Bring them into one protected section. Samuel looked toward the village again. We have stone. You have mud. Straw too. Then you have most of what you need. Samuel stood. His face tightened. There's something else. Clara waited. The council wants to return your house. For the first time, she looked directly at him. Samuel continued. Aldous Croft agreed. The name brought back the common house. Wood benches. Men speaking over her life as if she were not sitting in the room. Her mother's table. Her father's tools. A crooked finger pointing toward the road. Clara rubbed her thumb across the scar on her palm. You gave it away. Yes. And now you want to give it back. Yes. Because the village needs me. Samuel did not answer quickly enough. Clara gave a short nod. That's what I thought. Samuel lowered his eyes. She turned toward the cave, then stopped. Tell them I'll come down tomorrow. Samuel looked up. To stay? To teach. The following morning, Clara descended Beartooth Ridge for the first time since November. She did not carry everything. That mattered. Her blankets remained in the cave. So did the seeds. So did the iron pan and most of the wood. The mountain shelter was still hers. Buck followed behind her on a rope. When Pine Hollow came into view, Clara slowed. Nothing looked quite the way memory had kept it. Snow had narrowed the road. Several fences had collapsed. Canvas covered one damaged roof. Smoke hung low between the houses. People stood outside when she entered. No one cheered. No one should have. Clara walked through the village with Buck's rope in one hand and a bundle of tools in the other. The first stop was the ward cabin. Ruth had already begun. A low barrier of stone and packed mud lined the north side. Hay had been stuffed beneath the beds. One room was closed entirely. The stove now heated half the space it had heated before. Eli sat at the table wrapped in wool. He looked up when Clara entered. You came down. For today. He nodded as though that distinction made perfect sense. Clara checked the walls, then the chimney, then the floor. Raise this bed another 4 inches. Thomas Bell grabbed 2 blocks. At the Finch house, the problem was different. Their root cellar had taken water. Much of the grain was gone. Clara stood in the cellar with Garrett Finch, while cold water glistened along one wall. She crouched and touched the wet earth. You keep food here again. It happens again. Garrett nodded. What do we do? Move what's left upstairs. Warmer air spoils it faster. Frozen water spoils it faster than that. He almost smiled. Then he called for his sons. They moved the grain. Clara asked for flat stones. By afternoon, children were carrying them from the creek bed. Women heated the stones beside hearths, wrapped them in old cloth, moved them into beds. Men packed mud and straw into wall gaps. Families closed spare rooms. Animals were crowded into smaller protected sections of barns. Wood use dropped by the second night. Not dramatically. Enough. That word again. Enough. Clara stayed 3 days. She slept at Ruth's house the first night. On the second, she slept in the old workshop behind the sawmill. Samuel offered her the Merritt house. She never entered it. On the third morning, Aldous Croft found her near the well. He looked older than she remembered. He carried a small wooden box. I need to speak with you. Clara kept filling the bucket. Aldous set the box on the well rim. These were your father's. Clara looked. Inside were 2 carving knives, a measuring square, and a brass hinge gauge. Tools from Edmund's workbench. She had believed them gone. Aldous rubbed his hands together. I found them in the loft. Clara touched the measuring square. Her father's initials were cut into one side. E.M. Aldous spoke quietly. The house should never have been mine. Clara looked at him. He did not continue. No excuse. No explanation. That helped more than one would have. What are you going to do with it? Aldous blinked. The house. Yes. He looked toward it. I don't know. Then learn something from this winter. He waited. Clara lifted the wooden box. A house is only useful if it keeps someone alive. She walked away. By the end of February, Pine Hollow had changed its habits. Not its nature. Habits. That was enough to matter. Every north-facing barn had some form of wind barrier. Most beds had been lifted from cold floors. Families stored dry moss, straw, and flat heating stones alongside firewood. Chimneys were checked before storms, instead of after smoke appeared indoors. Wood was split smaller, when steady heat mattered more than large flames. Children learned which stones could be heated safely. Older people were moved away from outside walls before the temperature dropped. The village began watching the sky differently too. Clara had shown Thomas how the ridge revealed approaching weather. How distant sound carried strangely before some cold fronts. How sharp cloud edges could mean a fast change. How clear winter skies sometimes brought worse nighttime cold than snow clouds did. None of it made Pine Hollow safe. Mountains did not offer that agreement. But the village stopped waiting for winter to explain itself after damage had already been done. In early March, rain replaced snow for 3 days. The paths became brown streams. Ice slid from roofs. Water dripped constantly from the pines. Clara climbed back to the cave. The snow near the entrance had collapsed into dirty piles. Inside, everything remained where she had left it. She lit a fire. Then she took out the turnip seeds. The soil patch outside was still too wet to plant, but she began turning it with a short iron tool Jasper had traded her. Ash from the winter fire went into the soil. Composted leaves went in next. Buck's manure had broken down beneath its covering. She mixed that in too. A shadow crossed the ledge. Clara looked up. Silas Carter stood there. He was 24, a shepherd from the western side of the valley. She knew his face, but not well. He carried 2 sacks. Jasper said you might need seed. Clara wiped dirt from her fingers. What kind? Beans, turnips, some cabbage. He set them down. What do you want for them? Silas looked toward the wall. That. Clara followed his eyes. The wall? The knowledge. He explained that he spent weeks on the upper grazing ground each summer. Cold nights ruined sleep. Wind damaged his shelter twice the previous year. He wanted to build something better. Clara looked at the sacks, then at him. You build it with me. Silas nodded. Fair. They began after the thaw. The new shelter sat higher than Clara's cave, between 2 limestone faces that already blocked wind from the west and north. They worked 5 days. Silas carried the heavier stones. Clara chose their placement. He mixed mud and straw. She showed him why the lower course mattered most. They argued once about the entrance angle. Clara proved her point by throwing dry grass into the wind and watching where it settled. Silas moved the doorway. On the last afternoon, they sat outside the finished shelter eating bread and dried apples. Silas noticed Clara rubbing her thumb across an empty place in her coat pocket. Lose something? Clara shook her head. Then she remembered. The flint striker. Her father's. She had carried it through every night on the ridge. She took it out. Silas studied it. My grandfather had one like that. Clara turned it in her hand. He carried it hunting. Silas nodded. Good steel. Clara looked toward the valley, then toward the shelter they had built. She placed the striker in Silas's palm. He immediately tried to give it back. No. Clara, you're staying up here with sheep. I have matches. Matches get wet. He stopped. She closed his fingers around the striker. Silas said nothing more. That evening, Clara walked back toward her cave without it. Her hand entered the pocket twice out of habit. Both times it found nothing. By April, the The first turnip shoots broke through the soil outside the cave. Small green leaves. Almost nothing. Clara crouched beside them. Below her, Pine Hollow was repairing roofs, rebuilding fences, drying grain rooms, preparing gardens. Samuel Voss had converted part of the old Merritt house into a winter supply room. Blankets, dry straw, tools, stored kindling. No family lived there now. Clara had not asked him to do it. She did not move back. When the next November came, people climbed Beartooth Ridge before the first storm. Not because they were desperate, because they were preparing. Children came with their parents. Farmers brought notebooks. Women carried cloth sacks for moss. Men measured wall thickness. Clara stood beside the cave entrance and showed them where she had made her first mistake. The wrong sleeping place. The failed first wall. The smoke problem. The frozen bucket. She did not hide any of it. Near sunset, the visitors started down. One boy remained behind for a moment. He looked at the low stone wall. Did you know it would work? Clara looked at the uneven stones. Several still carried marks from the winter she had stacked them with bleeding hands. No. The boy waited. Clara picked up a loose stone and fitted it into a gap. I just knew the cold was coming. The boy ran after his family. Clara remained on the ledge. Snow had started falling. Small flakes settled on the dark stones above the entrance. Inside, the fire burned low. Outside, fresh footprints led from the cave toward Pine Hollow. Clara watched them until the snow began covering their edges. Then she carried one more armload of wood beneath the rock shelf and closed the wind barrier before nightfall. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and leave a like for more frontier survival stories.